In part 2, we saw the horrifying reality of Kai Lama, where 28 stolen children were stripped of their names, bleached of their identities, and raised to believe their leader was a living god. Anne Hamilton-Byrne thought she had built an unbreakable fortress of silence. But she was wrong. On a cold morning in 1987, the silence didn't just break, it shattered. As we're about to see, one girl's desperate run through the Australian bush was a spark that set Anne's entire empire on fire. The raid is starting, the Lady Jesus is on the run, and the world is finally about to see what was hidden behind those gates. Welcome back to Echoes and Oddities, where strange things from the past never stay buried. I'm Ivy Monroe. If you've missed the start of this investigation, catch up on parts 1 and 2 in the Family Cult playlist. But right now, we're diving straight into the end of this insane story. The beginning of the end did not come because Anne Hamilton-Byrne suddenly confessed. It did not come because the adults around her woke up one morning and decided to tell the truth. And it did not come because the family willingly opened its doors. It came through the children, through questions, through rebellion, through escape. Through survivors who slowly began to understand that what had happened to them was not normal, and that the world outside needed to know. For years, Anne's world had depended on control. Control of information, control of movement, control of relationships, control of identity, control of fear. But children do not stay small forever. They grow. They watch. They remember. They start noticing the gaps between what they are told and what they feel. Inside the family, the children had been raised to believe Anne was their mother. They had been told they were special, chosen, part of something spiritual and important. But as some of them got older, that story became harder to hold together because the rules did not feel loving. The punishments did not feel holy. The isolation did not feel protective. And the woman they were told to worship did not always feel like a mother. A child can be trained to obey. A child can be frightened into silence. A child can be punished for asking questions. But somewhere underneath all of that, there is still a part of them that notices. A part of them that says, something is wrong here. And inside the family, that quiet knowing began to grow. Some of the children became harder to control. Some resisted. Some rebelled. Some started pushing against the world Anne had built around them. And when a controlled system starts to lose control over the very people it was built to shape, the danger for the leader becomes real. One of the most important people in this part of the story was Sarah Hamilton-Byrne, later known as Sarah Moore. Sarah had been raised inside the family. She had been one of the children Anne claimed as her own. She knew the rules. She knew the fear. She knew what it meant to live inside that closed world. And as she got older, she began to push back. Sarah's rebellion mattered because it threatened more than just household order. It threatened the illusion. Anne's power depended on the idea that her world was perfect, that the children were chosen, that the adults were loyal, that everyone understood their place. But a rebellious child exposed something dangerous, that maybe the children were not grateful. Maybe they were not spiritually transformed. Maybe they were trapped. Eventually, Sarah was expelled from the group, and that decision would help change everything. Because once she was outside the tightly controlled world of the family, she could begin to see it differently. She could begin to speak. She could begin to tell people what had been happening. And that is one of the most important things to understand about leaving a high-control group. Getting physically out is only one part of it. Mentally, emotionally, spiritually, the group can still live inside you. The fear can stay. The loyalty can stay. The confusion can stay. The voice of the leader can stay. So for someone like Sarah to speak out was not a small thing. It took enormous courage. She had to question the entire story she had been given about her life, who her mother was, who her siblings were, what her name meant, whether the adults around her had protected her or betrayed her, whether the world outside was really dangerous, or whether the true danger had been inside the place she called home. And Sarah was not the only one. Another important survivor connected to the exposure of the family was Leanne Crease. Like Sarah, Leanne had lived inside that world. And like Sarah, she carried knowledge that outsiders did not have. The kind of knowledge that can only come from being there, from knowing the rooms, the routines, the punishments, the adults, the secrets. When survivors began speaking, the story started to move beyond whispers. It moved beyond rumor. It moved beyond people saying, something strange might be happening up there. Now there were voices from inside, children who had lived it, young people who could describe what had happened, and what they described was horrifying. They spoke about isolation, harsh discipline, food deprivation, beatings, drugs, the lie that Anne was their mother, the way adults around them seemed to obey her completely, and the way the family had hidden behind spiritual language while children suffered. But even then, getting the outside world to understand was not easy, because cult stories often sound unbelievable to people who have never lived near one. People hear the details and think, how could that happen? How could adults allow it? How could children be taken and renamed? How could educated people believe this woman was divine? How could something like this exist so close to ordinary life? And that disbelief can become another barrier for survivors. Because when the truth sounds too strange, people sometimes hesitate. They question the victim. They look for simpler explanations. They assume there must be more to the story. And in this case, there was more to the story, but not in the way skeptics might hope. The deeper investigators looked, the darker it became. A journalist named Marie Moore also became connected to the effort to expose the family. She had been investigating Anne and the cult, and through her contact with survivors, especially young people like Sarah and Leanne, the story began to gain more outside attention. Marie was not just hearing gossip. She was hearing accounts from people who had lived inside the group. And those accounts were difficult to ignore. Still, going after Anne Hamilton-Byrne was not simple. Anne had loyal followers. She had money. She had social connections. She had people who had helped her for years. And the family was not some open organization with a sign out front. It was secretive, layered, protected. The kind of group where outsiders might see only fragments, while the most damaging truths stayed hidden. And then there was the problem of proof. Survivors could describe what had happened, but investigators needed evidence. They needed records. They needed witnesses. They needed a way to connect Anne and her followers to the systems that had allowed children to be taken, renamed, drugged, and controlled. That kind of case is hard to build, especially when years have passed, especially when the victims were children, especially when many of the adults involved had every reason to deny, minimize, or disappear. But the survivors' voices mattered. They gave police a way in. They showed that the rumors were not just rumors. They revealed that behind the images of matching children and spiritual language was something far more serious. And slowly, the pressure began to build. For Anne, this must have been one of the first real signs that her control was slipping. Because for years, she had decided who knew what, who belonged where, who could speak, who could leave, who was family, who was not. But once survivors began talking to outsiders, Anne could not fully control the story anymore. And that is dangerous for any cult leader. Because cults survive by controlling the narrative. They tell members what the outside world is. They tell members what the leader means. They tell members what pain means. They tell members what love means. But when someone escapes and begins telling the story in their own words, the leader's version starts to crack. Imagine being one of the children still inside. You may not know everything happening on the outside. You may not know who is speaking. You may not know police are listening. But something in the atmosphere changes. Adults become tense. Rules may become sharper. Fear may become louder. Secrets feel heavier. And the world that once seemed sealed begins to feel unstable. By the mid to late 1980s, the family's perfect image was no longer as protected as Anne wanted it to be. Former members were talking. Survivors were speaking. Journalists were asking questions. Police were beginning to look closer. And the children still at Kai Lama were no longer completely invisible. That matters, because invisibility had protected the abuse. The world did not have to ignore what it could not see. And for years, the children had been kept behind distance, secrecy, and adult loyalty. But now, the outside world was starting to see them, not as Anne's perfect spiritual family, not as strange little children in matching clothes, but as possible victims. Children who may have been taken from their true identities. Children who may have been abused. Children who needed help. And once that shift happened, everything started moving toward the moment Anne's world could not survive. The police would come. The property would be entered. The children would be removed. And the carefully built image of the family would be exposed as something far darker than many outsiders had imagined. But before that day came, the people trying to expose Anne had to push through fear, disbelief, and the cult's powerful wall of secrecy. Because the family had spent years making itself hard to reach, hard to understand, hard to investigate. And Anne had spent years making herself feel untouchable. But she was not untouchable, not forever. Because the same children she tried to control, the same children she renamed, isolated, and shaped into her perfect image, would become part of the reason her hidden world was finally brought into the light. And that is where the story begins to turn. Not into justice yet, not into healing yet, but into exposure, into the first real interruption of Anne's power, into the day when police arrived at Kai Lama and the children of the family were finally taken out of the world Anne had built around them. On August 14, 1987, the hidden world Anne Hamilton-Byrne had built finally cracked open. For years, the children at Kai Lama, the secluded property near Lake Eildon, had lived inside a reality Anne created for them. A world of matching clothes, bleached blonde hair, strict rules, spiritual fear, punishment, isolation, and lies about who they really were. But on that day, the outside world came through the door. Police arrived at the property, and the children Anne had claimed as her own were removed from the place they had been raised to believe was home. Try to imagine how confusing that moment must have been. For investigators, it was a rescue. For outsiders, it was the long-awaited exposure of a disturbing secret. But for the children, it may not have felt simple. Because when a child is raised inside control, rescue can feel frightening too. They were not just leaving a house, they were leaving the only world many of them truly knew. They were leaving the adults who had controlled them, the routines that had shaped them, the fear that had surrounded them, and the woman they had been told was their mother. That is one of the hardest parts of stories like this. The day the door opens is not the day everything becomes easy. It is the day the truth begins. And sometimes, the truth is almost too heavy to carry all at once. After the raid, the public image of the family began to collapse. This was no longer just rumor, no longer just whispers about a strange spiritual group in the hills. Now there were children. There were allegations. There were questions about adoption records, questions about abuse, questions about drugs, questions about how a woman like Anne Hamilton-Byrne had managed to gather children, rename them, isolate them, and hide so much for so long. And once investigators began looking deeper, the story only became more complicated. Because the family was not just one woman in one house. It was a network of believers, professionals, helpers, people who had protected Anne's image, people who had helped keep secrets, people who had participated in systems that allowed children to lose their true identities. The raid exposed the children, but it did not immediately bring Anne to justice. Anne and her husband, Bill Byrne, left Australia. And for years, investigators had to chase a case that stretched beyond one property, beyond one state, and eventually beyond one country. In 1989, police launched a special investigation known as Operation Forest. Its mission was to investigate the family, including allegations of abuse and the use of LSD. And leading investigators had to untangle a story that was almost unbelievable on the surface. A glamorous yoga teacher who claimed to be Jesus, a respected physicist who helped validate her, educated followers, stolen or falsely registered children, a remote property, a secretive spiritual group, and survivors trying to explain what they had lived through. But a case like this is not easy to prove, especially when so much happened behind closed doors, especially when children were involved, especially when documents had allegedly been falsified, especially when loyal followers could deny, minimize, or refuse to cooperate. Investigators needed more than horrifying stories. They needed evidence. They needed paperwork. They needed people from inside the system willing to talk. And one of the major breaks came when former insiders began confirming pieces of what survivors had said. Former members and people connected to the group helped reveal that adoption fraud and false documents had been part of the story. And that mattered. Because while the abuse allegations were emotionally devastating, paperwork gave investigators something more concrete to pursue. Documents, names, birth records, declarations. The kind of evidence that could follow Anne even after she disappeared. And for Anne, disappearing became part of the story. After the raid, she and Bill were believed to have spent time outside Australia. Investigators heard different things. That Anne might be in the United Kingdom, that she might be in the United States, that she could be here or there. But for years, she remained out of reach. And while she was gone, the survivors were left with the aftermath. They were the ones trying to rebuild, trying to understand their identities, trying to process what had happened, trying to live with the fact that the woman who had controlled their childhood was still not standing before a court in the way many people believe she should. That delay matters, because justice delayed can feel like another form of abandonment. The children had already waited years for someone to see them, and even after the world saw them, Anne was still not immediately held accountable. Then, in 1993, the search finally caught up with her. Anne Hamilton-Byrne and Bill Byrne were arrested in the United States with help from the FBI. The woman who had once seemed untouchable, the woman followers had treated as divine, the woman who had built an entire world around control, was finally in custody. But even that moment was complicated, because arrest is not the same as justice. Being found is not the same as being fully held accountable. And as survivors would soon learn, the legal system would not deliver the kind of ending many people might expect from a story this disturbing. Anne and Bill were brought back to Australia, and for a moment, it may have seemed like the whole truth would finally be dragged into daylight. The children, the false identities, the punishments, the drugs, the control, the years of secrecy, the people who helped her, all of it. But the law does not always move the way pain moves. The law needs specific charges, specific evidence, specific standards of proof. And when abuse happens inside closed systems, especially years before a full investigation, proving every part of it can become painfully difficult. So although the raid had exposed the family, and although Operation Forest had followed Anne across borders, the final legal outcome would leave many people stunned. Because after everything survivors had described, after the children were removed, after the allegations of abuse, LSD, false paperwork, and stolen identity, Anne Hamilton-Byrne's punishment would be far smaller than the story itself. And for many survivors, that may have been one of the hardest truths of all. Not only that it happened, not only that adults allowed it, not only that Anne escaped for years, but that when the system finally caught up with her, it still did not fully answer for what had been done. And while she was gone, the survivors were left with the aftermath. They were the ones trying to rebuild, trying to understand their identities, trying to process what had happened, trying to live with the fact that the woman who had controlled their childhood was still not standing before a court in the way many people believe she should. That delay matters, because justice delayed can feel like another form of abandonment. The children had already waited years for someone to see them, and even after the world saw them, Anne was still not immediately held accountable. Then, in 1993, the search finally caught up with her. Anne Hamilton-Byrne and Bill Byrne were arrested in the United States with help from the FBI. The woman who had once seemed untouchable. The woman followers had treated as divine. The woman who had built an entire world around control was finally in custody. But even that moment was complicated, because arrest is not the same as justice. Being found is not the same as being fully held accountable. And as survivors would soon learn, the legal system would not deliver the kind of ending many people might expect from a story this disturbing. Anne and Bill were brought back to Australia, and for a moment, it may have seemed like the whole truth would finally be dragged into daylight. And this is the part of the story that can feel almost impossible to accept. Because after everything that had been uncovered, after the children were removed from Kai Lama, after survivors described abuse, isolation, drugs, false identities, and years of control, Anne Hamilton-Byrne did not spend the rest of her life in prison. She did not face the kind of punishment many people might expect from a case this disturbing. And for the children who had lived inside her so-called perfect family, that reality became another wound. When Anne and Bill Byrne were brought back to Australia, the charges centered largely on fraud and false documents, not the full emotional weight of what survivors said they had lived through. Not every beating, not every punishment, not every day of hunger, not every lie about who those children really were. Not every moment a child was made to believe Anne was their mother. The law narrowed the story down to what it believed it could prove. And that is where the pain of this case becomes especially sharp. Because survivors can carry a truth in their bodies for the rest of their lives. They can remember the fear, the hunger, the confusion, the punishments, the drugs, the way adults looked away, the way identity was taken from them. But a courtroom asks for something different. Evidence, records, dates, documents, witnesses, charges that fit into legal boxes. And sometimes, the worst parts of a story are the hardest to prosecute. Anne and Bill were accused in connection with falsified birth registrations involving children who had been presented as their own. But many of the more serious allegations tied to abuse and control did not result in the kind of convictions survivors and investigators had hoped for. In the end, Anne and Bill pleaded guilty to making a false declaration, and they were fined $5,000 each. $5,000. For a case involving children whose identities had been rewritten, children who had been raised inside a cult, children who had been told lies about their own lives, children who would spend adulthood trying to untangle what had happened to them. It is hard to say that number without feeling the imbalance, because the harm was enormous, the punishment was small. And for many people connected to the case, that felt like a failure. Not just a legal failure, a moral one. Former detective Lex DeMann, who spent years investigating the family, later spoke about Anne in harsh terms. And whether someone agrees with every word he used or not, his anger showed how deeply the case affected even people who were trained to deal with disturbing things. Investigators had seen enough to understand that this was not just a strange spiritual group. It was a system that had damaged children. And yet, the legal ending did not seem to match the scale of what had been exposed. For the survivors, that meant healing had to happen without the clean ending people often imagine. There was no neat final scene, no perfect courtroom reckoning, no moment where every hidden truth was acknowledged and punished. Instead, many survivors were left to rebuild their lives in the shadow of a system that had failed to fully answer for what happened to them. And rebuilding after something like the family is not simple. Because when your childhood has been built on lies, you do not just walk away and start fresh. You have to learn who you are. You have to learn what parts of your life were real. You have to learn your own history, your own name, your own family connections, your own instincts. Some survivors eventually found biological relatives. Some learned pieces of their origins. Some spoke publicly about what happened. Some helped expose the truth. Some carried their pain privately. And some spent years trying to make sense of a childhood where love, fear, obedience, and survival had all been twisted together. That is one reason this story is so haunting, because the damage was not only physical, it was emotional, psychological, spiritual, and deeply personal. Anne Hamilton-Byrne did not just take control of where children lived. She took control of the story they were told about themselves. And when someone does that to a child, the wound can last for decades. Anne, meanwhile, lived for many more years after the case. Her husband, Bill, died in 2001. In her later years, Anne reportedly lived in a nursing home and suffered from dementia. And to some people, there was something deeply bitter about that ending. Because the woman who had controlled so many people's memories, the woman who had rewritten children's identities, the woman who had built her power on certainty, image, and control, spent her final years losing parts of her own mind. But even that does not feel like justice. It feels more like irony. Because dementia is not accountability. Old age is not accountability. Death is not accountability. And for survivors, the fact that Anne eventually became frail did not erase what she had done when she had power. Anne Hamilton-Byrne died in 2019 in the Melbourne nursing home. She was in her late 90s. By then, the family had been exposed for decades. Documentaries had been made, books had been written, survivors had spoken out. The world knew her name. But knowing her name did not undo the harm. And that is the part of this story we have to sit with. The family was not only shocking because of the blonde hair, the matching clothes, the LSD rituals, or the strange claims of divinity. Those details are disturbing. They are memorable. They are the kind of details that make people stop and say, how could this be real? But underneath all of that was something even more painful. Children were treated like possessions. Adults surrendered their judgment. A leader wrapped control in the language of love and spirituality. And the systems meant to protect vulnerable people did not stop it soon enough. The children of the family were raised to believe Anne was everything: mother, teacher, God, truth. But the real truth was that Anne Hamilton-Byrne was not divine. She was a woman who built an image so powerful that people ignored what was happening behind it. A woman who used beauty, mystery, wealth, spirituality, and fear to create a world where her word mattered more than anyone else's life. And maybe that is why this case still stays with people, because it forces us to look at how danger can hide behind things that look respectable. A yoga class, a spiritual retreat, a wealthy circle of followers, a beautiful woman in elegant clothes, a house full of children who appear neat, quiet, and well-behaved. From the outside, people may have seen order, but inside that order was control. Inside that family was isolation. Inside that spirituality was manipulation. And inside Anne's perfect image were children whose real lives had been stolen from them. The family cult is often remembered as one of Australia's most disturbing cult cases. But it should also be remembered as a survivor story. Because Anne's world did not fall apart because she chose to tell the truth. It fell apart because people who lived inside it found the courage to speak. Children grew up. Questions became louder. Survivors stepped forward. Journalists listened. Investigators pushed. And the perfect image finally cracked. That does not make the ending fair. It does not make the punishment enough. It does not give the children back the years they lost. But it does mean Anne did not get to keep the story sealed forever. And for a leader who built her entire world on secrecy, that exposure mattered. The children were not just Anne's perfect family. They were real people, with real names, real histories, real pain, and lives that belonged to them long before Anne ever tried to claim them. And that is where the story of the family should end, not with Anne as the center, but with the people who survived her, the people who had to rebuild from the lies, the people who prove that even in a world built on control, the truth can still find a way out. The story of the family is disturbing for so many reasons. The stolen identities, the matching children, the spiritual manipulation, the drugs, the isolation, the adults who looked the other way, and the painful truth that justice never fully matched the harm. But more than anything, this story is disturbing because it reminds us how easily control can hide behind beautiful language. Family, faith, healing, purpose, spiritual growth. Those words can mean something good. But in the wrong hands, they can become tools. Tools to silence people. Tools to separate families. Tools to make cruelty sound meaningful. Tools to make one person's power feel like destiny. Anne Hamilton-Byrne built a world where she was mother, teacher, and God. But the truth is, the children at the center of this story were never hers to own. They were real people, with real names, real families, real histories, and real lives that belonged to them. And if there is anything to take from this story, maybe it is this. A perfect image does not always mean a safe one. A spiritual leader is not above question. And when children are kept hidden, isolated, renamed, or taught to fear the outside world, someone needs to ask why. The family may have tried to stay unseen, unheard, and unknown. But survivors made sure the truth did not stay buried forever. And that is what matters. If you made it this far, thank you for spending this time with me. This was a longer story, but some cases need room to breathe. And the family is one of those stories. I'm curious what you think. Should we do a deeper video on Anne Hamilton-Byrne herself? Not just the cult, but the woman before the cult. Her childhood, her reinvention, her marriages, her rise as a spiritual figure, and how she became the kind of person who could convince so many people to follow her. Let me know in the comments. And if you like strange, dark, and forgotten stories like this, stories involving cults, mysteries, disturbing history, and the parts of the past people do not always talk about, make sure you subscribe to Echoes and Oddities. You can also like this video, share it with someone who loves deep dive stories, and leave a comment letting me know what case you want me to cover next. Thank you so much for watching and for coming on this journey through the family with me. This is Echoes and Oddities, and I'm your host, Ivy Monroe. I'll see you in the next one.